Therapists, what's the most controversial way you've dealt with patients who cancel appointments? The text came through at 11:53 a.m., 7 minutes before our scheduled session. So sorry, Dr. Garrett. Emergency at work. Need to reschedule. I stared at my phone screen, watching those words blur as my jaw clenched tight enough to hurt. This was the 8th cancellation in 10 weeks from the same patient, always with less than an hour's notice, always with an excuse that sounded plausible enough that I couldn't quite call it a lie. I sat in my office, door closed, with the space heater humming and rain drumming against the window, and I made a decision that would eventually cost me my license, my reputation, and nearly my sanity. I texted back, "Understood. See you next week." Then I grabbed my coat, locked my office, and drove to her workplace to see what this emergency actually looked like. What I found there started a chain of events that would expose something so disturbing that by the time it was over, 3 people would be in prison, and I'd be testifying before the state psychology board about whether I'd violated every ethical principle I'd sworn to uphold. My name is Nathan Garrett, and I'd been a licensed clinical psychologist for 11 years when this started. I ran a private practice in Portland, Oregon, specializing in trauma and anxiety disorders. I had a comfortable client load of about 25 patients, a small office in a converted Victorian house near Hawthorne, and a reputation for being effective if a bit unconventional in my methods. I'd built my practice from nothing after finishing my doctorate at the University of Washington, and I was proud of what I'd created. I wasn't rich, but I was stable, respected in my field, and genuinely good at helping people navigate their darkness. I took my ethical obligations seriously. Patient confidentiality was sacred, boundaries were non-negotiable, and I'd never once crossed a line that would compromise my license or my integrity. Until Melissa Crowley became my patient. Melissa had been referred to me 6 months earlier by her primary care physician, Dr. Alan Foster, who'd noted she was experiencing severe anxiety and panic attacks. She was 32, worked as a project manager at a tech startup downtown, and presented as intelligent, articulate, and deeply troubled by what she described as work-related stress. Our first few sessions were productive. She opened up about childhood issues with her mother, talked about perfectionism and fear of failure, showed genuine insight into her patterns. I genuinely liked her as a person and believed I could help her. Then the cancellations started. First, it was a stomach bug, then a client crisis at work, then her car broke down, then a family emergency. Each time, she'd cancel with less than 24 hours notice, which meant I couldn't fill the slot and lost that income. Each time, she'd apologize profusely and reschedule. Each time, she'd show up for the next appointment and act like nothing had happened. By the 6th cancellation, I addressed it directly in session. "Melissa, I've noticed a pattern of last-minute cancellations. Can we talk about what's really going on?" She looked genuinely confused, like she hadn't realized the pattern herself. "I know, I'm so sorry. Work has just been insane, and things keep coming up. I promise I'm committed to this process." She seemed sincere, and I wanted to believe her, so I explained my cancellation policy. 24 hours notice required, or she'd be charged for the session. She agreed, seemed relieved to have clear boundaries, and I thought we'd solved the problem. The next week, she canceled at 11:48 a.m. for a noon appointment. Emergency meeting with a client. Had to reschedule. I charged her for the session as stated in my policy. She paid without complaint. Then did the same thing the following week. Something about it bothered me beyond the lost income and scheduling headache. It was the pattern, the precision of it. Always less than an hour before the appointment, always a work emergency, always with the same apologetic tone that somehow felt rehearsed. I started paying closer attention to the details she'd share in our sessions about her job. She worked for a company called TechVantage Solutions, a mid-sized firm that did software consulting for healthcare companies. She'd mentioned her boss, Gregory Stone, multiple times, always with a strange mixture of admiration and anxiety. She'd talked about big projects with tight deadlines, important clients, the pressure to perform. But when I'd ask specific questions, what exactly did her role entail, which clients was she working with, her answers became vague, general, almost scripted, I told myself I was reading too much into it, that not every patient wanted to bore their therapist with work details. But my gut said something else. The 8th cancellation was different, though I didn't realize it at first. Emergency at work could mean anything, and ordinarily I would have just marked it in my schedule and moved on with my day. But I'd had my morning coffee, I'd reviewed my notes from her previous sessions, and I'd noticed something that made my skin prickle. In our last session, she'd mentioned that Thursday, today, was supposed to be a light day because her boss was out of town at a conference in San Francisco. She'd actually said she was looking forward to our session because work would be calm for once. So what emergency could have possibly come up that required her immediate attention if her boss wasn't even in the building? I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, arguing with myself about boundaries and professional ethics, and the fact that following a patient to verify their excuse was absolutely, unquestionably inappropriate. Then I grabbed my keys and drove to her office anyway. TechVantage Solutions was located in a sleek glass building in the Pearl District, all modern architecture and expensive landscaping. I parked across the street in a public lot where I had a clear view of the entrance, feeling ridiculous and slightly sick to my stomach. What was I doing? If anyone found out about this, I could lose my license. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the pattern of cancellations wasn't just avoidance or poor time management, but something else entirely. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching employees come and go on their lunch breaks, and then I saw her. Melissa walked out of the building at 12:15 p.m., not in the business casual attire she usually wore to our sessions, but in running gear, athletic leggings, a jacket, expensive running shoes. She wasn't rushing, wasn't on her phone looking stressed about an emergency. She looked relaxed, almost happy, as she jogged down the street heading west toward the waterfront. I followed her. I know how that sounds, and I knew it then too, but I'd already crossed the line by coming here, and some part of me needed to understand what was happening. She ran for about a mile, then slowed to a walk near the river. She pulled out her phone, checked it, and sat down on a bench overlooking the water. For 15 minutes, she just sat there, occasionally looking at her phone, watching the river, completely at ease. No emergency, no crisis, no legitimate reason why she couldn't have been in my office for our scheduled appointment. Finally, she stood up, stretched, and jogged back the way she'd come. I waited until she was out of sight, then drove back to my office feeling a mixture of vindication and deep unease. I'd confirmed my suspicion that she was lying about the emergencies, but I'd also violated her privacy in a way that could end my career if she ever found out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the pattern, about the specific timing of her cancellations, about the way she'd looked so calm and content sitting by that river while supposedly dealing with a work emergency. I thought about all the sessions we'd had where she'd presented as someone desperate for help, someone genuinely struggling with anxiety and stress. Was it all performance? And if so, why? What did she gain from repeatedly scheduling therapy appointments she had no intention of keeping? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to talk to someone who could help me make sense of this without violating confidentiality any further. I called my former supervisor, Dr. Ellen Price, a clinical psychologist with 35 years of experience who'd mentored me through my licensure process and who I trusted implicitly. We met for coffee the next morning at a quiet place in Northwest Portland. Dr. Price listened to my story without interrupting, her sharp blue eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she set down her cup and said, "Nathan, you know you screwed up by following her, right?" I nodded. "I know. But Ellen, something's not right here. The pattern is too consistent, too deliberate. I think she's using therapy appointments for something, I just can't figure out what." Ellen was quiet for a moment, then said, "Have you considered that she might be engaged in some form of fraud, using scheduled appointments as an alibi or a cover for something else?" I hadn't considered that, actually, and the possibility made my stomach drop. "Like what?" Ellen shrugged. "I don't know, but people don't establish patterns like this without a reason. My advice? Document everything meticulously, maintain your boundaries from here forward, and if you see any indication of harm to self or others, you have a duty to report. But Nathan, if you follow her again, you're done. You understand that?" I understood. The next session with Melissa was scheduled for the following Monday at noon. I fully expected her to cancel, but she didn't. She showed up right on time, bright-eyed and apologetic about the previous week's cancellation. "I'm so sorry about Thursday," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "The client call went longer than expected, and by the time I was free, our session was already over." I looked at her carefully, watching for any sign of deception, any tell that would indicate she knew I'd seen her by the river. Nothing. Her expression was open, sincere, exactly what you'd expect from someone who genuinely regretted missing an appointment. I made a decision in that moment to test her. "That's okay," I said. "These things happen. Tell me about the client call. Which client was it?" She didn't miss a beat. "Oh, it was MedTech Solutions, one of our healthcare clients. They were having issues with the data migration system we'd implemented, and my boss needed me to troubleshoot it." But I'd been taking notes during our previous sessions, and I remembered that 3 weeks ago she'd mentioned MedTech Solutions had completed their project and was no longer an active client. I didn't call her on it directly. That would have revealed I'd been paying too much attention to details she probably thought were throwaway comments. Instead, I said, "That sounds stressful. How did you resolve it?" She launched into a detailed technical explanation that sounded plausible, but was just vague enough that I couldn't verify any of it. We spent the rest of the session discussing her anxiety symptoms, her relationship with her mother, surface-level therapeutic work that felt increasingly hollow. When she left, I immediately wrote down everything she'd said, every inconsistency, every detail that didn't quite add up. I was building a file, though I wasn't sure yet what I was building it for. Over the next month, the pattern continued. She'd show up for 2 sessions, then cancel the third with less than an hour's notice. The excuses varied. Client emergency, boss needed her immediately, urgent deadline. But they all happened at the same time of day, always right before our noon appointment, always on a Thursday or a Friday. I started cross-referencing her cancellations with her previous statements about her work schedule, and none of it made sense. Days she'd previously said would be busy, she showed up for therapy. Days she'd said would be light, she canceled for emergencies. It was like she was operating on a completely different schedule than the one she described to me. And then there was the money. I noticed that she always paid her bills immediately, never questioned the cancellation fees, and seemed to have no financial stress despite working at a mid-level position at a startup. When I'd carefully asked about her financial situation in the context of discussing life stressors, she'd been dismissive. "Oh, I'm fine. I make decent money and I'm careful with budgeting." I decided to do something that was ethically questionable, but not quite as egregious as following her again. I called TechVantage Solutions and asked to speak with Melissa Crowley. The receptionist put me through to her desk, and Melissa answered on the second ring. "This is Melissa." I hung up, but now I knew she was actually employed there, that the company existed, that at least that part of her story was true. It was a small thing, but it helped me feel slightly less paranoid. I called back an hour later and asked for Gregory Stone, her boss. The receptionist said, "Mr. Stone doesn't work in this office. He's based out of our Seattle location. Can I take a message?" That was interesting. Melissa had mentioned multiple times that her boss worked in the Portland office, that she interacted with him daily, that his office was just down the hall from hers. Another inconsistency to add to the growing list. 3 weeks later, everything changed. Melissa scheduled an appointment for Friday at noon, and for the first time in 2 months, I was genuinely surprised when she showed up. She looked different, tired, with dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her shoulders that I hadn't seen before. "Are you okay?" I asked as she sat down. She nodded, but it wasn't convincing. "Just a rough week at work. I'm glad we're meeting today. I need to talk through some things." For the next 45 minutes, she opened up in a way she never had before. She talked about feeling trapped in her job, about pressure from her boss to do things that made her uncomfortable, about ethical lines she wasn't sure she should cross. When I asked for specifics, she became vague again, but the emotion seemed real. She was scared of something, and for the first time, I believed I was seeing the actual person beneath the performance. Near the end of the session, she said something that made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. "Dr. Garrett, if you found out a patient was doing something illegal, would you have to report them?" It was exactly the kind of question that makes therapists extremely careful about how they respond. "It depends on the situation," I said slowly. "I'm required to report if there's imminent danger to yourself or others, or if there's abuse of a child or vulnerable adult. Beyond that, our conversations are confidential. Why do you ask?" She shook her head. "Just curious. I've been watching a lot of true crime shows, and I wondered how that worked in therapy." It was a lie. I could see it in the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, in the forced casualness of her tone. She was testing me, trying to understand the boundaries of confidentiality, and that meant she was involved in something she thought might require reporting. The session ended, and she left, and I sat in my office for a long time, trying to decide what to do with this information. I called Ellen Price again. This time, I met her at her office, a comfortable space filled with books and plants, and the kind of calm energy that comes from decades of clinical work. I told her about the session, about Melissa's question, about my growing certainty that she was involved in something illegal or dangerous. Ellen listened, then said, "Nathan, you're at a crossroads. Either you're projecting your suspicions onto a patient who's just flaky and dealing with work stress, or you're right, and this patient is using therapy as some kind of cover for illegal activity. Either way, you need to make a choice. You can terminate her as a patient, refer her to someone else, and walk away clean. Or you can keep working with her and risk getting pulled into whatever this is. What's your gut telling you?" My gut was telling me that if I walked away now, I'd never know the truth, and something about that felt like abandoning someone who might actually need help, even if she was lying about almost everything else. I kept her as a patient. The next scheduled session was a Thursday at noon, and I was absolutely certain she'd cancel. She didn't. She showed up early, actually, sitting in my waiting room at 11:45 reading something on her phone with an intensity that suggested it wasn't good news. When I brought her back to my office, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Melissa, what's going on?" I asked. She took a deep breath and said, "I think I need to stop coming to therapy for a while. Things at work are getting really complicated, and I don't have time right now." It was the first time she'd ever suggested ending our therapeutic relationship, and the timing felt significant. "Okay," I said carefully. "Can you tell me what's changed?" She shook her head. "I just need to focus on work right now. I'll call you when things settle down." The session lasted maybe 15 minutes before she left, and I had the distinct feeling I'd just been preemptively fired because she thought I was getting too close to something she didn't want me to see. I didn't hear from her for 3 weeks. Then, on a Wednesday evening around 8 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and Melissa's voice came through, shaky and scared. "Dr. Garrett? I need help. I think I'm in trouble." My heart rate spiked immediately. "What kind of trouble? Where are you?" There was a long pause, and I could hear traffic in the background. "I can't talk about it on the phone. Can we meet somewhere? Not your office? Somewhere public?" Every ethical guideline I'd ever learned was screaming at me that meeting a patient outside of normal office hours in a non-clinical setting was inappropriate, but the fear in her voice was real. "Okay, where?" She named a coffee shop in Selwood, a neighborhood across the river from my office. 30 minutes? I grabbed my jacket and headed out. She was sitting in the back corner when I arrived, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. I sat down across from her and said, "Talk to me. What's going on?" She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I've been lying to you. About almost everything, and now I don't know how to fix it. I waited, letting the silence stretch. Finally, she continued. The cancellations, the work emergencies, none of it was real. I was meeting with someone, doing something I shouldn't have been doing, and I used our therapy appointments as cover because I knew you'd document the cancellations, and I'd have a paper trail showing where I was supposed to be. My stomach turned over. What were you actually doing? She looked away. Selling prescription medications that I was stealing from my mother's medical supply company. She owns a pharmaceutical distribution business, and I had access to her inventory systems. I was supposed to be in therapy, but instead, I was meeting with buyers and making drops. The confession hung in the air between us. I tried to process what she'd just told me, tried to reconcile the intelligent, anxious woman I'd been treating with someone who'd been using our therapeutic relationship to facilitate drug trafficking. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because it's all falling apart. My mother's company is being audited, and they're going to find the inventory discrepancies. When they do, they're going to trace it back to me. And the people I was selling to, they're not happy that I won out. I needed someone to know the truth before everything explodes. I sat there, my mind racing through my ethical obligations. She was confessing to a crime, but she wasn't expressing intent to harm herself or others. She was an adult, making terrible choices, but not meeting the threshold for mandatory reporting. Melissa, I can't give you legal advice, but I strongly suggest you get an attorney, and you need to be honest with them about everything. She nodded. I know. I just needed to tell someone. I'm sorry I lied to you all those months. I'm sorry I wasted your time. She stood to leave, and I said, Wait, why did you come to therapy in the first place? If you were just using it as an alibi, why bother with the actual sessions? She smiled sadly. Because I actually do have anxiety and panic attacks. I actually am struggling with the relationship with my mother. Just because I was lying about the cancellations doesn't mean everything else was fake. I thought maybe I could get help for the real stuff while using the appointments to cover the illegal stuff. I know that sounds insane. She left, and I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with this information. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I called my attorney the next morning. Robert Langston was a healthcare attorney I'd used when setting up my practice, and he was well-versed in the ethical and legal obligations of mental health professionals. I explained the situation without using Melissa's name, framing it as a hypothetical. Robert listened, then said, Let me be very clear. Unless she expressed imminent danger to herself or others, you have no duty to report what she told you. Patient confidentiality applies to confessions of past crimes. However, if you believe she's currently engaged in ongoing criminal activity that could harm others, that's a gray area. My advice? Document everything, consider whether continuing to treat her poses a risk to you or your practice, and be prepared for the possibility that law enforcement might get involved independently of anything you do. I thanked him and hung up, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff with no good options for where to jump. 2 days later, I got a call from Detective Lawrence Kane with the Portland Police Bureau's Major Crimes Unit. He identified himself with his badge number and asked if I had a patient named Melissa Crowley. My throat went dry. I can't confirm or deny whether someone is my patient without their written consent, I said, using the standard response I'd been trained to give. Detective Kane's voice was patient, but firm. Dr. Garrett, I understand your confidentiality obligations, but Ms. Crowley has been arrested in connection with a prescription drug theft ring, and your name came up during the investigation. Specifically, she listed multiple therapy appointments as alibis for times when she was allegedly meeting with co-conspirators. We need to verify whether she actually attended those appointments. My hands started shaking. Detective, I need to consult with my attorney before I can respond to any of your questions. Can I call you back? Robert Langston explained that I could verify attendance at appointments without violating confidentiality, but I couldn't discuss the content of our sessions without a court order or Melissa's written consent. I called Detective Kane back and confirmed that Melissa Crowley had been my patient, that she had scheduled regular appointments, and that she had canceled approximately 30% of those appointments with less than an hour's notice. I provided the dates and times of the cancellations from my records. Detective Kane thanked me, then said, Dr. Garrett, one more thing. Did Miss Crowley ever discuss her work or family business with you? I had to be careful here. Detective, I can't discuss the content of our therapeutic sessions without proper authorization. You'll need to obtain a court order if you need that information. He sighed. Understood. You'll probably be hearing from the DA's office. Thanks for your cooperation. The next 3 weeks were a nightmare. I was served with a subpoena to appear before a grand jury investigating Melissa and her co-conspirators. The subpoena requested all of my records related to her treatment, including session notes, billing records, and correspondence. I had to hire Robert Langston to help me navigate the process, which cost me thousands of dollars I hadn't budgeted for. The state psychology board opened an investigation into whether I'd violated ethical guidelines by following Melissa to her workplace and meeting with her outside of normal clinical hours. I had to submit a written response explaining my actions, and the board assigned an investigator, Carol Brennan, a stern woman with 28 years of experience in professional licensing enforcement, to review my case. My malpractice insurance carrier was notified, and my premiums spiked. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and started having my own panic attacks for the first time in my life. The grand jury appearance was scheduled for a Friday morning in late November. I showed up at the courthouse at 9 a.m., accompanied by Robert Langston, feeling like I was the one on trial. The grand jury room was smaller than I expected, with 23 citizens sitting in rows looking at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. The assistant district attorney, Michelle Torres, a sharp woman in her mid-30s with a reputation for being thorough and relentless, led me through questions about my treatment of Melissa. How often had we met? What were the dates of her cancellations? Had she ever discussed her mother's business? Had she ever mentioned illegal activity? I answered carefully, confirming facts that were documented in my records, but refusing to discuss the content of our sessions without more specific questions that would help me determine what was covered by confidentiality and what wasn't. Then Michelle Torres asked the question I'd been dreading. Dr. Garrett, did you ever have any suspicions that Miss Crowley was using her therapy appointments as cover for illegal activity? I looked at Robert, who gave me a small nod indicating I could answer. Yes, I said. The pattern of last-minute cancellations, combined with inconsistencies in her statements about her work schedule, made me suspicious that she wasn't being truthful about why she was canceling. Michelle leaned forward. What did you do about those suspicions? This was it. This was where I either told the truth and potentially lost my license, or lied under oath and committed perjury. I took a deep breath. I followed her to her workplace on one occasion to verify whether she actually had a work emergency as she claimed. I observed her leaving her office building in athletic wear and going for a run by the river. No emergency was apparent. The room went silent. Michelle Torres looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Dr. Garrett, you followed your patient without her knowledge or consent? I nodded. Yes. I knew it was inappropriate, and I've regretted it ever since. But I felt something was wrong, and I needed to understand what was happening. Michelle made a note, then continued. Did you ever report your suspicions to anyone? I explained about consulting with Dr. Ellen Price and with my attorney, both of whom I'd spoken to in general terms without identifying Melissa by name. The grand jury asked a few more questions, then dismissed me. Robert and I walked out of the courthouse into gray drizzle, and he said, Well, you told the truth. That'll help with the ethics board, but it's going to make things complicated. I knew what he meant. I'd violated patient privacy, and there would be consequences. The state psychology board hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the news broke that Melissa and 4 co-conspirators had been indicted on charges of theft, trafficking prescription medications, and conspiracy. The story made the local news, and because my name had come up in court documents as her therapist, a reporter from the Oregonian called asking for comment. I declined, but the damage was done. My practice took a hit as patients started wondering if I'd violated Melissa's confidentiality and whether I might do the same to them. I lost 6 patients in 2 weeks, including 2 I'd been working with for years. My income dropped by a third, and I had to take out a loan to cover my legal expenses and reduced revenue. I started seeing my own therapist, Dr. James Hutchinson, a colleague who specialized in therapist burnout and vicarious trauma, because I was rapidly approaching a breakdown. The psychology board hearing took place in a conference room at the state licensing office in Salem. The board consisted of 5 members, 3 psychologists, 1 public member, and 1 attorney, who sat on one side of a long table while I sat on the other, with Robert Langston beside me. Carol Brennan, the investigator, presented her findings. She'd interviewed Dr. Ellen Price, reviewed my session notes with Melissa, examined my billing records, and talked to several of my other patients to assess whether this was part of a pattern of boundary violations. Her conclusion was damning. I had violated patient privacy by following Melissa to her workplace, I had met with her outside of normal clinical boundaries by agreeing to meet at a coffee shop in the evening, and I had failed to properly document my concerns about her truthfulness in a way that would have protected both her interests and my own. The board members asked me questions for 90 minutes, and I answered honestly, admitting my mistakes while trying to explain the context that had led to my decisions. The board chair, Dr. Raymond Foster, a clinical psychologist with 30 years of experience and a reputation for being fair but strict, looked at me over his reading glasses and said, Dr. Garrett, we appreciate your honesty about your actions. However, what you did represents a serious breach of professional ethics. You violated patient privacy, you established a dual relationship by meeting outside of clinical boundaries, and you allowed your personal suspicions to override your professional judgment. Can you explain to this board why we shouldn't revoke your license? I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Because I was trying to help my patient, I said. I made mistakes, serious ones, and I take full responsibility for them. But everything I did came from a genuine concern that she was in danger or was endangering others. I didn't act out of malice or self-interest. I acted out of a misguided attempt to understand what was happening so I could better serve her therapeutic needs. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I hope it provides some context. The board deliberated for 2 hours while I sat in the hallway with Robert, my stomach churning and my mind racing through all the possible outcomes. Finally, they called me back in. Dr. Foster read their decision aloud. My license would be suspended for 6 months, during which time I would be required to complete 30 hours of continuing education on professional ethics and boundaries, undergo supervision with a board-approved psychologist, and submit monthly reports on my progress. After the suspension period, I would be on probation for 2 years, during which any ethics violation would result in permanent revocation of my license. I would also be required to pay a fine of $5,000 to cover the costs of the investigation. It was harsh but not career-ending. I could work with this. I thanked the board, signed the necessary paperwork, and walked out of that building feeling like I'd just survived something that should have killed me. The next 6 months were the most difficult of my professional life. I had to close my practice temporarily, refer all of my patients to other therapists, and figure out how to survive financially without income from my clinical work. I took a consulting job with a healthcare technology company, doing user experience research for mental health apps, which paid enough to cover my basic expenses, but felt hollow compared to actual clinical work. I completed my ethics training, which felt like punishment, but was actually valuable. It forced me to confront how badly I'd screwed up and to develop better strategies for handling situations where I suspected a patient might be lying or engaging in harmful behavior. My supervisor, Dr. Angela Morrison. Wait, I can't use Morrison. My supervisor, Dr. Angela Reeves, a seasoned psychologist who specialized in ethics consultations, was tough but fair, pushing me to really examine my motivations and decision-making process. During this time, Melissa's case went to trial. I wasn't called to testify, but I followed the proceedings through news reports. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had surveillance footage, recorded phone calls, financial records, and testimony from multiple co-conspirators who'd agreed to plea deals. Melissa's attorney tried to argue that she'd been coerced by her boyfriend, one of the main organizers of the drug ring, but the evidence showed she'd been an active and willing participant. The jury deliberated for 3 days and found her guilty on all counts. The judge, Honorable Patricia Daniels, a federal judge with a reputation for tough sentencing in drug cases, sentenced Melissa to 8 years in federal prison. Her mother, whose pharmaceutical distribution company had been the source of the stolen medications, testified at the sentencing hearing about the betrayal she felt and the damage to her business. It was devastating to watch, even from a distance. What haunted me most was the question of whether I could have done something differently, something that might have helped Melissa before she'd gotten in so deep. If I'd confronted her about the inconsistencies earlier, would she have opened up? If I'd been more direct about my suspicions, could I have guided her toward making better choices? Or was she already too far gone, too committed to the illegal activity, too convinced she could manage both lives at once? Dr. Reeves helped me process these questions in supervision, reminding me that I wasn't responsible for my patients' choices, only for maintaining appropriate boundaries and ethical standards in my own behavior. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd failed her somehow, even though I knew rationally that her choices were her own. When my 6-month suspension ended, I reopened my practice with a much smaller client load and a very different approach to patient boundaries. I was hypervigilant about inconsistencies now, documenting everything meticulously, consulting with supervisors and colleagues when anything felt off. I'd lost the naive trust I'd once had in the therapeutic relationship, the belief that patients were always telling the truth, or at least trying to. I'd learned that people are complicated, that they can be simultaneously vulnerable and deceptive, desperate for help, and actively sabotaging themselves. My new patients didn't know about the suspension. It wasn't public record in the same way that a license revocation would have been, but I carried it with me like a weight, a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong when you let your judgment get clouded by suspicion or personal involvement. A year after Melissa's sentencing, I got a letter from her. It had been forwarded through the prison system and arrived at my office in a plain envelope with her name and inmate number in the return address. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, unsure if I wanted to read what she had to say. Finally, I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in neat cursive. She apologized for lying to me, for using our therapeutic relationship as cover for illegal activity, for putting me in a position where I'd had to compromise my ethics. She explained that she'd been in an abusive relationship with the man who'd organized the drug ring, that he'd manipulated her into participating by exploiting her financial insecurities and her strained relationship with her mother. She said therapy had actually helped her, that the work we'd done on her anxiety and her family issues had given her tools she was using in prison to stay stable and work toward rehabilitation. She didn't ask for anything, didn't request that I write a letter for parole consideration or maintain contact. She just wanted me to know that despite everything that had happened, our work together had mattered. I read that letter multiple times, trying to decide how I felt about it. Part of me was angry that she'd put me through everything I'd endured because of her choices. Part of me was sad for the wasted potential, for the intelligent woman who'd made terrible decisions and was now paying an enormous price. But mostly, I felt a strange sense of closure. She'd acknowledged what she'd done, taken responsibility for it, and found some value in the therapeutic work despite the circumstances. I wrote her back, a brief, professional response thanking her for the letter and encouraging her to continue working on her recovery. I didn't promise to stay in touch, didn't offer anything beyond that acknowledgement. It felt appropriate, boundaried, the kind of response the post-suspension version of me had learned to give. 2 years after my license suspension ended, my probationary period concluded, and I was finally a psychologist in good standing again. The ethics violation would remain on my record permanently, visible to anyone who looked up my license, but I'd completed all requirements and demonstrated my commitment to ethical practice. My practice had rebuilt to about 15 patients, a manageable load that allowed me to give each person the attention they deserved without the financial pressure that had contributed to my poor judgment with Melissa. I'd developed a reputation for being particularly skilled at working with patients who had difficulty trusting therapists, which was ironic given my own trust issues now. I'd also started teaching ethics seminars for early career psychologists, sharing my story as a cautionary tale about what happens when you let suspicion override professional judgment. The controversial method I'd used to deal with a patient who canceled appointments, following her to verify her excuse, had cost me 6 months of my career, tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and lost income, and a permanent mark on my professional record. But it had also exposed a criminal operation, potentially prevented additional harm from the distribution of stolen prescription medications, and taught me lessons about boundaries and ethics that I never could have learned any other way. When I tell this story to other therapists, they're usually split in their reactions. Some think I was reckless and deserved everything I got. Others think I was trying to help and got caught in an impossible situation. I think both are true. I made choices that violated my professional ethics, but I also uncovered a truth that needed to be exposed, even if the way I did it was wrong. Looking back now, 3 years after that first text message canceling our appointment, I understand that the real lesson wasn't about how to deal with patients who cancel or how to verify if they're telling the truth. The lesson was about knowing when to let go, when to accept that some things are beyond your control, and when to trust the process rather than trying to control the outcome. I'd violated Melissa's privacy because I couldn't tolerate not knowing, couldn't accept that maybe she was just a flaky patient with poor boundaries. My need for certainty had led me to cross lines I should never have crossed. The irony is that if I'd just terminated her as a patient after the pattern of cancellations became clear, if I'd simply said, "This therapeutic relationship isn't working, and I'm referring you to someone else," none of the subsequent mess would have happened. She might have continued her illegal activities with a different therapist providing inadvertent cover, but I wouldn't have compromised my ethics or nearly lost everything I'd worked for. But I also know that if I'd made the safe choice, if I'd protected myself rather than following my instincts, Melissa might still be out there stealing medications. Her mother's business might have suffered even more damage before the theft was discovered, and potentially dangerous drugs might have ended up in the wrong hands. The fact that my unethical actions led to a positive outcome doesn't justify those actions. Ethics don't work that way, but it does complicate the narrative. I was wrong in how I handled it, and I paid a price for that. But the outcome mattered too, and I can't entirely regret a chain of events that prevented harm, even if I should have found a different way to get there. These days, when I get a last-minute cancellation from a patient, I note it in my records. I apply my cancellation policy if appropriate, and I address the pattern in our next session if it continues. I don't follow anyone. I don't investigate. I don't let my suspicions override my professional boundaries. I've learned that my job isn't to catch people in lies or to verify their excuses. My job is to provide a safe, boundaried space where people can work on their mental health and to maintain my ethical obligations regardless of whether they're being completely honest with me. If that means some patients take advantage of the therapeutic relationship for purposes I don't understand, that's on them, not on me. I've made my peace with the limits of what I can control. The manila envelope Melissa had metaphorically handed me when she started canceling appointments contained a truth I wasn't supposed to seek out, a reality that should have been discovered through proper channels rather than my own amateur investigation. When I opened that envelope by following her to her workplace, I set in motion a series of events that exposed her crimes, but also exposed my own ethical violations. We both faced consequences. Hers were far more severe, involving years in federal prison, but mine were significant enough to fundamentally change how I practice my profession. And in the end, that's probably the most controversial thing about how I dealt with a patient who canceled appointments. I learned that sometimes the right answer is to do nothing, to let go, to trust that the truth will emerge on its own timeline, rather than forcing it into the light through inappropriate means. If you're reading this and you're a therapist wrestling with a similar situation, here's my advice. Consult with supervisors and colleagues, document everything, maintain your boundaries, and trust the process. If you're reading this as someone who's considering using therapy appointments as cover for illegal activity, know that patterns reveal themselves eventually, and the consequences of being caught are far worse than the temporary convenience of having an alibi. And if you're reading this as someone who's just interested in the messy reality of how therapy sometimes works, understand that therapists are human too, that we make mistakes, and that the difference between a good therapist and a bad one isn't whether they struggle with ethical dilemmas, it's whether they're willing to take responsibility when they get it wrong. The last time I saw Melissa's name was in a news article about a prison education program she'd enrolled in, studying business administration and working toward a degree she planned to use when she was eventually released. The article mentioned that she'd been a model inmate, participating in therapy and substance abuse counseling, and was projected for early release after serving 6 years of her 8-year sentence. I hope that's true. I hope she finds a way to rebuild her life after prison, to use what she learned in our brief therapeutic relationship to create something better. And I hope that when she thinks about the therapist who followed her to her workplace and ultimately contributed to her arrest and conviction, she understands that I was trying, however imperfectly, to help. Because at the end of the day, despite all the ethical violations and professional consequences and personal cost, that's what this whole messy situation was about. Trying to help someone who turned out not to want the kind of help I was offering, and learning the hard way that you can't save people from themselves, no matter how controversial your methods. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.